Hi, my name is Professor Joanne Hardman and I'm from the University of Cape Town. Today I'd like to talk to you in two sets of slides. First, learning theories, and second, neurodivergence and neurotypical development. These slides that I will be talking to you about are related to in the book that is being published by Oxford University Press called Educational Psychology in Social Context. These slides talk to what happens in the book and what is outlined in the book. They provide you with a sense of how people develop, as well as what would be called normal development, normal in inverted commas, being evolutionary and societally accepted development, and neurodivergent thinking, being thinking that is not unfolding the way we would expect it to. In these sets of slides, I will explain three important learning theories, first of all, before going on and explaining how children can be different and neurodivergent and how we can deal with these children in our class to help them to reach the standards that we would expect all children to be able to reach. Thank you. Hello everybody, my name is Professor Joanne Hardman and I'm going to talk to you today about learning theories which we cover in our book on educational psychology in social context. What are learning theories and why do we need to know them? Well, first of all, how does a child develop? If we don't know how a child develops, we can't know how they learn and what is typical and what is not typical. So let me ask you a question about nature versus nurture. Are we born with innate knowledge that unfolds over time, or does nurture, our environment, determine how we develop? Well, neither determines how we develop. They work together. We are born with certain predispositions to learn, but it is our environment that very much determines what we turn into as an individual. And this is why we need to know about learning theories. The first theory I'll cover today is the theory of cognitive constructivism, proposed by a genetic epistemologist called Jean Piaget. Now, Jean Piaget was very concerned with how individuals universally acquire knowledge and how knowledge changes as they develop. So we can think of knowledge as learning. Genetic epistemologist means genesis, the beginnings of epistemology, knowledge. So a genetic epistemologist is someone who's interested in how knowledge develops and changes over time. Piaget proposed that we are born with certain functions of intelligence. Now, don't be misled to think that these actually exist in our brain. These are theoretical constructs that Piaget proposes may exist. In the modern age, because Piaget died in the 1980s, in the modern age, we do know that we are born certainly with certain predispositions that help us to learn. For Piaget, the first was assimilation, and this refers to making sense of new information in terms of what you already know. So, for example, if I was to put my hair down as opposed to up, you would be able to assimilate that it is still me because you know my voice, but you would then have to accommodate to know that I can occur with my hair up in a ponytail or my hair down. Accommodation results in the modification in cognitive structures in light of new information that clashes with what is existingly known. So when you come across something that you can't assimilate, there is a clash in your brain, a dis-ease in the brain that leads to accommodation, and so your cognitive structures in your brain will develop. Piaget is a stage theorist, and he believes that children go through various stages in order to develop into the human adult that you see in front of you today, which is me. The first stage is the sensory motor stage. So sensory motor, we learn through our senses and through moving. And this is about birth to 2 years old. But please know that the ages for the stages may differ. You can't skip a stage for Piaget. You can't go from sensory motor to concrete operational. But The actual ages may differ. In other words, they may not be birth to 2, it may be birth to 3, but you can't skip a stage. The pre-operational stage is about 2 to 7 years old, and these children understand the world through language and mental images and symbols. They're still pre-operational, operational referring to logical thinking. So they are before logical thinking. So, for example, a pre-operational child, if you take them to a cemetery, might think that the cemetery kills the person because they see all the coffins going into the cemetery. So the cemetery might be killing the people, when in fact that's pre-logical, because it's in fact the end point of when you are dead that you get buried. Concrete operational children are children who think in concrete form. Okay, so they need concrete instantiations of something in order to solve a problem. So if you're teaching fractions, for example, it might be good to bring in a cake that you can cut into equal shares, or a pizza or an apple or whatever, that they can see a concrete manifestation of what it is you're trying to teach them. They are not yet able to learn abstractly. Formal operational thinking for Piaget, which is about 12 years onwards, they understand the world through hypothetical thinking and scientific reasoning. They are us, basically. These are the stages that Piaget hypothesized exists in development. The next theory I want to talk about is Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory. This is a very nice theory because it places the individual, as you can see the U in the center of the diagram, it places the individual child in the environment that they grow up in, recognizing that the environment at various levels can impact on the child. So let's say, for example, you have a change in the curriculum, which is at the mesosystem level. You wouldn't think changing the curriculum could affect an individual child, but it does. Okay, we need to know all the systems that operate on the child. And these are like, the systems are like nested Russian dolls. Microsystem, closest to the child, okay? These are the people and places the child interacts with. The mesosystem is the connection between microsystems. So between granny's house and mommy's house, for example. They are not directly involved. The mesosystem is not directly involved in the child's actual unit, but it could be something like the parents' workplace. The macrosystem is the larger cultural context. This includes society's values, laws, and culture. So, for example, cultural beliefs about education or religious beliefs about God will impact on the child in their lived experience in school. The chronos system refers to time, and children change over time. I don't need to tell you that. From going from an infant to an adult, there is a qualitative and a quantitative change. The child develops more knowledge quantitatively, but also their brain shifts. The last theory I want to talk to you about is sometimes called sociocultural theory in the West, but in the East, in Russia, where it originated, it's called cultural historical theory, and it is associated with the work of the psychologist Lev Vygotsky. Now, Vygotsky said that children were active cognizing agents. They actively learnt through interaction with others. He very famously said that a child never approaches an object without being mediated. The meaning of everything in the world that is constructed in the world, that is made in the world, is mediated to that child. The very notion of something being a table, the meaning of what a table is, for example, is not something a child will find through interacting with the table. They will need to be mediated about what the meaning of the table is. So mind, in fact, the unique human way of thinking is social. It's mediated through another person. Meaning is mediated predominantly through language in a space that he calls the zone of proximal development. I'd like to think of this as the zone of next development. The zone of proximal development is the zone of their potential to learn from another competent other. When I say a competent other, I'm talking about someone who has more knowledge in that field than the child currently does. The zone of proximal development is very poorly understood in education. Some people think it refers to scaffolding. Vygotsky never used the word scaffolding, and scaffolding refers to discrete tasks and not to development. The zone of proximal development refers to development and not to discrete tasks such as solving a puzzle at a given time or solving a sum at a given time. Scaffolding and the ZPD are not synonymous. In the zone of proximal development, scientific abstract concepts, so when I say scientific, I'm not referring only to concepts in science, I'm referring to all abstract concepts. The word verb is an abstract concept. You can't see it. You need to be taught what a verb is. A 2-year-old does not know what a verb is. They may be able to walk and run, in other words, to do a verb, but they don't know what a verb is. They need to be taught that. Everyday concepts are the spontaneous concepts that the child learns empirically through sight, smell, sound, taste, motor action. These are the concepts that they come to your class with, the things that they learn in their everyday experience. And it is up to you as a teacher to interpenetrate the abstraction with the child's spontaneous knowledge. The abstraction gives meaning, global meaning to something, and the spontaneous is the sense I make of what you are telling me. This is quite a nice diagram of the zone of proximal development. At the beginning, there is no zone of proximal development. In the middle of the circle, you can do something independently. The zone of proximal development is where you can do something if guided. That is the zone of proximal development. Remember, this guidance is not scaffolding. This guidance takes place over a long time. You want to pitch your teaching within the zone of proximal development, that space where they do not know, where they are not yet familiar with the concept you are teaching. I'll give you an example about the difference between scaffolding and the zone of proximal development. In grade school, in grade 1, children may learn the alphabet song, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Now, can they read? No. They can recite the alphabet, and they can learn to do that by being scaffolded through singing. In order to learn to read, this is going to take place through the zone of proximal development over about 3 years. It takes about 3 years to learn to read for meaning. Thank you very much for joining me today. One of the remarkable things that we've added to the book in some detail, the educational psychology book, is about neurodivergent and neurotypical students. What do I mean by neurodivergent and neurotypical? Well, it refers to the brain. Let's have a look at the brain. If you can see in this picture, what is the last thing to develop is in the prefrontal cortex. Judgment is the last thing to develop in a human brain. So if you look at the young brain, you can see a lot of development needs to happen. And as you go through the ages and stages, you find that even at 20 years of age, still there is difficulty with judgment and impulse control. This will come right at about 25 when the brain is perfectly developed. The brain's not set. It's able to grow and develop depending on its contexts. Its neural pathways can change. We call this neuroplasticity. If you can think of the brain like plasticine, it can change depending on the environment and learning. All executive functioning, that is all the functioning that is in the front cortex of your brain, is acquired during development through the environment. So you're not born with that, okay? So the ability to perceive, to inhibit, to judge is all developed as you grow in your environment. What does this mean about the brain? It means that the brain is developing always, and it's an excellent opportunity to teach. Now, when we talk about neurotypical and neurodivergent thinking, neurotypical are people who are developing according to evolutionary norms. They're developing in the way we would expect. Neurodivergent thinking refers to cognitive styles that are different from neurotypical. They're often associated with neurological differences, such as autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, Tourette syndrome, and other conditions. Now, neurodivergent thinking is not necessarily negative. It often brings unique strengths, such as creativity and hyperfocus and unconventional problem solving. However, a neurodivergent child does differ from a neurotypical child and may require different interactions in a classroom or in a therapeutic setting. It contrasts with neurotypical thinking, which aligns more closely with societal norms and expectations for learning. Let's talk about a specific form of neurodivergent thinking, attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder. If you look at the brain here, you can see that there is progressively increased activation in the right inferior frontal cortex during an fMRI feedback run in ADHD adolescents. So the inferior frontal cortex is increasingly activated, more so than a neurotypical child. ADHD is a neurodevelopmental disorder that affects a person's ability to regulate attention, control impulses, and manage activity levels. It usually begins in childhood and is diagnosed at around the age of 7. Grade 2, grade 3 is when children will be generally sent for a diagnosis to an educational psychologist. So what do we mean by problems with attention and hyperactivity and impulsivity? So basically, they have difficulty in sustaining focus on particular tasks in ADHD. This is because they tend to hyper-focus. They will focus on one thing at a time and tend to be disrupted by whatever is happening around them. They can be forgetful and disorganized. They may leave their bags at school. They may leave their lunch at home, for example. Hyperactivity refers to excessive movement or restlessness, fidgeting, difficulty sitting still, and talking excessively. And impulsivity is acting without thinking, okay, interrupting others, and difficulty waiting for one's turn. Of course, these can be dealt with in a classroom. If a child is hyperactive, you can give them something to do, something to play with. Perhaps you ask them to wipe the board for you. You can sustain inattention on a particular task if you break down the instructions for the student and chunk the work into smaller chunks. What causes ADHD? Many people say that sugar causes ADHD. Well, this is wrong. Sugar has no impact on ADHD. Genetics causes ADHD. We're not entirely sure of all the things that cause ADHD, but there's a strong link to the father having ADHD and this being passed on to the children. There are differences in brain structure and function. The structure of the brain is how the various lobes come together, and the function is how it works together to create thinking and problem solving, etc. So there may be a dopamine regulation problem. And there are environmental factors such as exposure to toxins during pregnancy or premature birth. These, we think, at the moment, research has shown that these are the causes of ADHD, but we still have a long way to go. Another neurodevelopmental disorder, neurodivergent thinking, is the autistic spectrum disorder. Now, what can we do with students with the autistic spectrum disorder if they happen to be in our classrooms? Well, one of the things we can do is provide predictability and consistency in the environment. This will help for ADHD children as well. In fact, for any neurodivergent children, promoting a predictable sequence of events in your class or your therapeutic room, and being consistent will help them to settle in. Giving clear instructions, giving short instructions, not having more than 2 instructions in one sentence, for example. Support their communication needs using clear and simple language. Manage sensory sensitivities. Children with ASD may be very sensitive to sensory overload, and you can provide quiet spaces where the child can go and reflect on their own or go and sit on their own. This will also work with children who are neurodivergent and have ADHD. Giving them a place to be quiet and calm can help them. Most importantly, with neurodivergent students, you must be adaptive in your teaching methods. So for autistic students, you would want to use multiple sensory means for teaching. This would also help for other neurodivergent children who may learn better through interacting with something or through doing experiments in science rather than listening to a lecture. Thank you very much for listening to me about neurodivergence and neurotypical thinking. One of the